Amidst the geopolitical tensions around Greenland, the USA and Europe, could the World Cup soon be used as leverage? Now, the reason I ask is that in the last 24 hours, many of you may have noticed this, a potential boycott, is it going to come to that, of the 2026 World Cup has been suggested as potential leverage against Donald Trump in response to his threats to acquire Greenland. We're all aware of that.
A German politician just suggested that Germany might boycott the 2026 World Cup in the United States unless Donald Trump backs off his threats to acquire Greenland. This isn't some random person on Twitter. This is an actual member of the German government floating the idea of using the biggest sporting event on Earth as political leverage against the American president. Do you think countries should actually boycott the World Cup over political disputes? Or should sports stay completely separate from politics no matter what? Let me know your take.
The US president believes his country needs Greenland for national security reasons. And now, Trump has not ruled out using military force. He's since vowed to implement economic tariffs on a whole host of EU states, including the UK, from February the 1st, until the US is allowed to buy Greenland.
So we've got a genuinely wild situation developing right now, where geopolitics and the World Cup are potentially about to collide in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War boycotts of the Olympics. And it all centers around Donald Trump's recent statements about wanting to acquire Greenland for what he calls national security reasons. Let's start with what actually happened, because the context matters here. Trump has been making noise about Greenland for a while now, saying the United States needs it for national security purposes. He specifically hasn't ruled out using military force to acquire it, which is absolutely insane when you think about it. We're talking about a NATO ally's territory potentially being taken by military action from another NATO member. Then Trump escalated things by threatening to implement economic tariffs on a whole bunch of European Union states, including the UK, starting February 1st, unless the US is allowed to buy Greenland. So he's essentially holding Europe's economies hostage over a territory that belongs to Denmark and isn't for sale. Now, here's where it gets interesting from a sports perspective.
The German politician Jürgen Hardt, a member of the Christian Democratic Union, a confidant indeed of the Chancellor of Germany, has raised the idea of a potential World Cup boycott in a German newspaper. This politician, Jürgen Hardt, had said dropping out the tournament would only be considered as a last resort in order to get Trump to see sense on the Greenland issue, pointing out that Trump has made it clear how important the World Cup is to him.
A German politician named Jürgen Hardt, who's a member of the Christian Democratic Union and apparently a confidant of the German Chancellor, raised the idea of a World Cup boycott in a German newspaper. He specifically said this would only be considered as a last resort to get Trump to see sense on the Greenland issue. Hardt pointed out that Trump has made it very clear how important the World Cup is to him personally. Trump loves being at the center of major sporting events. He shows up at UFC fights. He'll be at the Daytona 500. He wants to be seen as the leader of the greatest nation in the world at these massive cultural moments. And the World Cup in 2026 is going to be absolutely huge for the United States.
I guess the Europeans, or the Germans especially, they try to get any leverage on Trump, because right now it's really hard. How can you actually pressure him into doing anything, or into refraining from doing something? And that's why some politicians, you mentioned Jürgen Hardt, and also one member of the Social Democratic Party, brought up at least the scenario of boycotting the World Cup. Now, we remember probably ahead of the World Cup in Qatar, there were also discussions about a potential boycott, but for completely different reasons. Back then it was more the human rights situation in Qatar. Right now it's a much more dynamic geopolitical confrontation between the United States and a host of countries.
So the German thinking here is pretty straightforward. If you want to pressure Trump into backing down on Greenland, hit him where it hurts. And apparently, they think embarrassing him by having major football nations boycott his World Cup would be painful enough to change his behavior. But let's be real about how likely this actually is to happen. The immediate reaction from a lot of people, including some of the commentators discussing this situation, is that politics and sport shouldn't mix. There's this idea that football should stay in its lane and let politicians handle political disputes. That argument sounds good in theory, but it completely ignores reality. Sport and politics have always been connected. The Olympics were boycotted during the Cold War. South Africa was banned from international competition during apartheid. Russia got banned from major sporting events after doping scandals and political actions. The idea that sport exists in some pure bubble separate from the real world is just not accurate. What makes this situation particularly complicated is that we're talking about the host nation of a World Cup potentially being boycotted by major football powers. Germany isn't some small country that nobody would miss. They're a 4-time World Cup winner, one of the biggest football nations on the planet. If Germany boycotts and convinces other major European nations to join them, that fundamentally changes what the tournament is. And there's legitimate precedent for European nations joining together on boycotts. We saw discussions about boycotting Qatar over human rights issues, though obviously that didn't happen. But the fact that it was even seriously discussed shows that European nations are willing to consider using major sporting events as political leverage. The economic impact on the United States would be significant if a boycott actually happened. Hotels in host cities are already raising their prices by massive amounts, expecting huge crowds of international tourists. If half of Europe decides not to send teams or fans, that's billions of dollars in lost revenue. Trump cares about economic numbers and optics, so hitting him there might actually work. One of the commentators in the discussion made an interesting point about FIFA's regulations prohibiting political interference in football. That's technically true. FIFA has rules against governments getting involved in football matters. But let's be honest about how consistently FIFA enforces those rules. FIFA gave Trump a Peace Prize, literally created an award to give to Donald Trump. So the idea that FIFA is going to stand on principle and tell European nations they can't make political decisions about World Cup participation is laughable. FIFA is one of the most politically compromised organizations in sports. They've cozied up to Qatar, Russia, and now the United States under Trump. The argument that sport should stay out of politics also ignores that Trump himself has already made the World Cup political. He's using it as a showcase for American power and his presidency specifically. He's planning to be front and center at major matches. The tournament is happening during the 250th anniversary of American independence, and Trump absolutely wants to use that symbolism. So when Trump makes the World Cup about his political brand and American nationalism, and then Europeans say they might boycott over his political actions, suddenly people clutch their pearls about mixing sport and politics? That's completely inconsistent. There's also the visa situation, which is a separate but related political issue affecting the World Cup. Trump's administration is planning to reject visa applications from citizens of multiple countries, including Brazil. Can you imagine a World Cup with no Brazilian supporters? That's absurd. Brazil is in Scotland's group, and all 3 teams Scotland is playing apparently have fans on the list of people Trump doesn't want entering the country. That's Trump directly using immigration policy to impact who can attend the World Cup. But somehow when European nations consider boycotting in response to his political actions, that's crossing a line. The double standard is pretty obvious. Now let's talk about whether a boycott would actually work as leverage. Some people, including one of the commentators in that discussion, argue that Trump is transactional and this is all just negotiating tactics. The theory is that Trump makes extreme demands, gets people upset, then negotiates to a middle ground that's closer to what he actually wanted. That might be true for things like trade deals. But we're talking about territorial acquisition here. Denmark has been absolutely clear that Greenland is not for sale under any circumstances. What's the middle ground? Trump gets to rent Greenland on weekends? There's no realistic negotiation here because Denmark's position is non-negotiable. The other argument against a boycott is that it would punish players and fans who have nothing to do with the political dispute. German football fans want to watch their team compete at a World Cup. German players have worked their entire careers for this opportunity. Is it fair to take that away from them because of Trump's actions? That's a legitimate concern, but it's also exactly why a boycott would be effective leverage. If it didn't hurt anyone, it wouldn't pressure Trump to change course. The whole point of economic or political sanctions is that they create pain that motivates behavior change. What's particularly interesting about this situation is the timing. We're still months away from the tournament. There's time for this to blow over, for Trump to back down, or for cooler heads to prevail. But there's also time for the situation to escalate. If Trump actually follows through on tariffs against European nations, that could harden European resolve to use the World Cup as leverage. Denmark would probably be the first nation to boycott if this actually happens. They qualified through a playoff, and they're the country being directly threatened here. If Denmark boycotts and frames it as defending their sovereignty, that could create momentum for other nations to join them. The question is whether major football powers like France, England, Spain, and Italy would join a boycott. Germany alone boycotting would be significant, but not catastrophic for the tournament. But if you get 5 or 6 major European nations pulling out, suddenly the World Cup loses massive credibility as a true world championship. There's also the question of what FIFA would do in response. Would they ban countries that boycott from future tournaments? Would they try to force compliance? FIFA has the power to sanction national associations, but using that power against multiple major European nations would be incredibly risky politically and financially. One thing that's clear from the discussion is that Trump genuinely cares about sporting events and being associated with them. He wants to host the World Cup successfully because it fits his brand of American greatness and winning. He wants to be seen shaking hands with world leaders and football stars at matches. That vanity and desire for spectacle is potentially a real vulnerability that could be exploited. The counter-argument is that Trump doesn't back down from confrontation. If European nations threaten a boycott, Trump might dig in harder just to prove he won't be pushed around. That's certainly possible given his personality and track record. But there's also a chance that advisors would convince him the political and economic cost of a diminished World Cup isn't worth whatever strategic value he sees in Greenland. What's also worth considering is that this isn't just about Trump's ego. There are apparently real national security concerns that his advisors have raised about Greenland's strategic importance. Whether those concerns justify acquiring someone else's territory is obviously debatable, but they might not go away just because of World Cup pressure. The comparison to Qatar is instructive here. There were massive human rights concerns about that World Cup, extensive discussions about boycotts, and ultimately no major nations pulled out. But Qatar is not a NATO ally threatening to acquire another NATO ally's territory. The geopolitical stakes here are different and potentially higher. So Germany is threatening to boycott the 2026 World Cup over Trump's Greenland threats, and this situation could genuinely escalate into a major international crisis. Whether it's all political posturing or heading toward an actual boycott remains to be seen. If you want updates on this developing story, hit that like button and subscribe because this is far from over.